K'Andre Miller needs a big season for the New York Rangers. What are the best and worst case scenarios for the fifth-year defenseman? Plus, which D-man will replace Ryan Lindgren in the opening night lineup?
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1149 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Also, that song you were hearing in the intro is, of course, Leave the Lights On from our very good friends in Passafire. You can check those guys out anywhere you get your music. And today, going to go ahead and continue with our fun-filled offseason series. We do this every offseason. We take a look at every player that we project to make the Rangers opening night roster, and we go ahead and walk through the best and worst case scenarios for every single player. And today, we're continuing on with the defenseman, and more specifically, going to focus on K'Andre Miller. And as we always do, we'll get the worst case scenarios done first. We'll end with the good stuff, the best case scenarios for K'Andre Miller. So, worst case scenario for K'Andre Miller. You know, this is somebody that obviously was taken in the first round by the New York Rangers. And I think for the most part, you have to look at K'Andre Miller and call him a homegrown success story. I know there's some people that can be critical of Miller from time to time. And there are times where I think there's a certain amount of inconsistency that creeps into his game, and we're actually going to start right there. I think in a worst-case scenario for K'Andre Miller, that continues to be somewhat of an issue. There's times where this is somebody that looks like he's really going to take off and really become, you know, maybe not necessarily an elite NHL defenseman. It depends what your definition of elite is. If elite is like a top 5 or top 10 defenseman in the league, probably not. But if you're looking at elite as maybe being like the top 25, I think that's always, you know, at times been within striking distance for K'Andre Miller. When it really stood out to me was actually a couple of years ago in the playoffs. Not last year, not the year before that, but the year before that. That was the year when the Rangers were supposedly still rebuilding, and they make that awesome run through the playoffs. They make it to the Eastern Conference Final. K'Andre Miller was fantastic during that playoff run for the New York Rangers. And at that point, I'm thinking this dude's a superstar. Like it is upon us. He was only in his second season at that point and playing a top 4 role, a very critical role for this upstart Ranger team. The last 2 seasons have mostly been good for K'Andre Miller as well, but I think when he struggles, more often than not, it's just a lack of consistency, which is not uncommon for young players. But I think in a worst case scenario, this is year 5 for K'Andre Miller. You know, he's getting into his mid-20s, so he's starting to get up there a little bit. But yeah, I think worst case scenario, you see a situation where, you know, there's a chunk of games where he's not really that noticeable. He's not as engaged or locked in as he is when he's at his best. There's some games maybe where he's a little bit more of a passenger than you'd like him to be. There's times where we've seen that in the past from K'Andre Miller. I don't think it's flagrant. You know, we see worse offenders than that, you know, around the NHL in terms of like kind of taking a back seat and just sort of being a passenger. But, you know, I think overall, the one thing that's held K'Andre Miller back is inconsistency because, like I said, when he's at his best, he looks like he's ready to move into that upper echelon of NHL defensemen. It's the inconsistency that I think has held him back, at least somewhat, thus far in his career. And he's still been a very good player for the Rangers, but you always feel like with Miller, there's a little bit more in there. He's got a little bit more to give. And if he can ever figure out the consistency, he will get to that next level. I think also in a worst case scenario for K'Andre Miller, and to be fair here, you could really lump just about every Ranger defenseman into this one. I just so happen to be talking about it here with K'Andre Miller. But we saw it last year in the playoffs, specifically in the series against the Panthers, the struggles getting the puck up the ice, getting the puck out of the defensive zone. It wasn't just Miller. Like I said, this was a team-wide thing. It was really striking how often in that series between the Rangers and Panthers, the Panthers would have an offensive zone possession that would just go on forever. You know, there were times where maybe Miller and Trouba were on the ice and back on their heels, can't get the puck out of the zone. And, you know, in a lot of those situations, eventually the Rangers would finally clear the puck. But by the time you do that, everybody on the ice is gassed. All you can do is dump it into the offensive zone. Then you go off for a change. And then the whole cycle starts all over again. The Panthers get it back in, and away we go again. And the Rangers are back on their heels. And I think there's times where Miller, like a lot of the Ranger defensemen, does struggle to, get the puck out of his own zone. I think in a worst case scenario, you see a little bit more of that. Maybe not necessarily against like every team in the league, but against those elite forechecking teams. I think that's where, Miller, Trouba, and really the rest of the Ranger defensemen can find themselves getting back on their heels a little bit. I think also in a worst case scenario for Keandre Miller, I mentioned Trouba just a second ago. We've seen in recent seasons where the two of them do not exactly hit the ground running at the start of the season. So I think in a worst case scenario, we see Keandre Miller and Jacob Trouba get off to one of their recurring slow starts to a season. And that's assuming that Keandre Miller does indeed begin this upcoming season with Jacob Trouba as his defense partner. And we're going to elaborate on that a little bit more because that's not necessarily, set in stone. We could see Miller out there with Braden Schneider, maybe even with Adam Fox. Like I said, we'll get to that in just a little bit here. But again, we have seen this in the past where the two of these defensemen, the season starts and they're just not up to snuff. They just get off to a slow start. They're, constantly back on their heels, giving up, odd man rushes, giving up a lot of goals while they're on the ice. And as fans, all of us tend to, in general, I feel like all of us, not just Ranger fans, but hockey fans, in some ways we overreact to things, right? And we kind of overanalyze things. Well, we're especially kind of on pins and needles at the start of the season because whether it's the Rangers fans or fans of any other team, you really want to see your team hit the ground running, get off to a nice start. And when that doesn't happen, or maybe it does happen, but there's certain players that are lagging behind a little bit, it tends to stand out that much more. If Miller and Trouba have like a 4-game stretch right in the middle of the season where they're not really playing all that great, it's not going to stand out quite as much then, I don't think, as it would at the start of the season, or especially the playoffs. But you want to see these two get off to a better start this season. And I think the need for them to do that is amplified by the very simple fact that Ryan Lindgren is going to be out for what the Rangers have said, at least a few weeks. So he's not going to be available for at least a handful of games at the start of the season. We hope he gets back into the lineup sooner rather than later. But whether Lindgren is in the lineup or not, but especially when he's not in the lineup, we need players like Keandre Miller, Jacob Trouba to step up to that next level. And we can't afford to see these two get off to a little bit of a slow start this season. They got to hit the ground running and really bring it, right from the opening faceoff to the first game of the season. So those are kind of the worst case scenarios for Keandre Miller. We're going to keep everything rolling in just a second. I want to shift our attention to what else the best case scenarios for Keandre Miller. And at the end of today's episode, we're also going to take a look at where everything stands as it pertains to the Ranger defense. And obviously, Ryan Lindgren has that injury, not going to be available at the start of the season. So what does that mean? Who sneaks into the lineup as the sixth defenseman for this Ranger team? We're going to debate that a little bit later on today's episode as well. And we're going to do all those fun things in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. All you need to do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. You can win now with up to 110. Okay, let's try that again. You can win 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. PrizePicks is the best way to get action on sports in most states, including California, Texas, and Georgia. Want to play PrizePicks alongside Drewski, Joe Budden, and MMA champ Sugar Sean O'Malley? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries from some of the biggest names in the PrizePicks community each and every week. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code LOCKEDONNHL on PrizePicks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It is guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is also brought to you by Indeed. We are driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate is not to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree that Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by hearing you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Want to shift our attention to the best case scenarios for K'Andre Miller. Before that, though, huge shout out, as always, to the everydayers. Thank you guys, as always, for checking out the Locked On New York Ranger podcast. We're going to be keeping everything going, keeping tabs on roster battles, position battles, and whatnot. Obviously, we got the rest of the preseason to go as well, so we'll be breaking down those games after they happen. But for right now, best case scenarios for K'Andre Miller for this upcoming season. I think best case scenario for K'Andre Miller, he's out there, and I don't think this is going to happen, by the way, but on opening night, he's out there with Braden Schneider or possibly even Adam Fox. For starters, let me go ahead and just kind of lay out what I think will be the opening night defense pairings for the New York Rangers. And this can go a bunch of different ways. We'll see how everything shakes out. But this is what I think. This would be my preference if the Rangers were going to do it my way. My perfect, 6 defenseman lineup for the Rangers on opening night, given that we do not have Ryan Lindgren available, is Zach Jones with Adam Fox. You've got K'Andre Miller with Braden Schneider, and then you go Chad Ruhwedel with Jacob Trouba. Ruhwedel is typically on the right side, but as soon as the first practice after Lindgren got injured, they moved him to the left side to see what he can do there, and presumably to get him acclimated to that and potentially be on the left side on the third pairing when opening night, finally does roll around here. I got to say, I was tempted to just roll the dice and say, throw Victor Mancini out there. But the bottom line, we are talking about somebody who's a 5th-round pick, only 22 years old. And while the Rangers have debuted a lot of defensemen at a young age, this is somebody that, was not an overly heralded draft pick. Not that he can't possibly beat his draft pick status, but he wasn't a heralded draft pick. And he's only played a grand total of 17 AHL games. So I'm going to restrain myself just a little bit. We're going to go with Chad Ruhwedel as the number 6 defenseman on opening night. As far as what I think the Rangers will do on opening night, I think it's going to be basically what I just said, but I think you're going to see Jacob Trouba on the second pairing with that would be K'Andre Miller, and then you would see Braden Schneider on the third pairing with Chad Ruhwedel. I think that's what they'll probably end up doing. I think they'll end up putting Jacob Trouba back into a top 4 role. Regardless of everything I just said there, I think a best case scenario for K'Andre Miller, like I was saying, to bring it back to my original point here, is he's out there with Braden Schneider on opening night. Obviously, the majority of K'Andre Miller's NHL career has been spent with Jacob Trouba, and that pairing certainly has had success at times in the past. There's also been some times where they've really struggled quite a bit, and I just feel like watching this team last season, when we saw K'Andre Miller at his absolute best, it was almost always when he was out there with Braden Schneider. Braden Schneider at this point, to me, I think he's eclipsed Jacob Trouba in the pecking order. We'll see if the Rangers feel the same way. We'll be able to tell by what the depth chart is on opening night and whether Schneider or Trouba is on that second pairing there. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But the eye test, and I think even the metrics would back this up as well. K'Andre Miller last year, once again, at his best when he was out there with Braden Schneider. The two of them just really seemed to click. And I think in a best case scenario, we will see that. When it really started to happen was when Trouba, toward the end of the season, he was injured a little bit. He got suspended for a couple of games as well. That's when we saw that pairing, get some run. The two of them were together for a good chunk of the postseason as well. I want to say it was Game 6 against the Canes when they flip-flopped the two of them, Schneider and Trouba, and put Trouba back with Miller. And, that did okay for a while. But again, eye test, metrics, go with whatever you want to go by. I think K'Andre Miller was at his best when he was out there with Braden Schneider. And on top of that, I mentioned this just a second ago as well. We also should not rule out the possibility of K'Andre Miller starting the season with Adam Fox. Fox needs a new dance partner. Ryan Lindgren, his BFF, is out of the lineup for right now. So I think it could be Zach Jones. I think that's where I would lean. That was a short-lived pairing a few years ago, and Zach Jones was just debuting at that time, but I think overall they did well together. I think it could be a fun pairing. You'll see a lot of excellent passes, two guys who really see the ice very well. But Miller could be out there with Fox. We've seen it at times in the past. The two of them tend to kill penalties together, but we've never seen Miller and Fox get like a long leash together, a lot of rope, or any sort of regularity. The two of them playing together, at least at even strength, that they do kill penalties together at times. But we'll see. Basically, not to be mean, not to pile on, because we've talked enough about Jacob Trouba, but I think in a best case scenario, Miller's out there with anybody other than Jacob Trouba on opening night. Like I said, he did bear with Schneider last year, and Adam Fox is Adam Fox. I think just about any defenseman will probably jump at the chance to play with him. But we'll see how it goes. We'll see if the Rangers feel the same way. But I think in a best case, you have Miller out there, preferably with Braden Schneider to start this upcoming season. I think also in a best case scenario for K'Andre Miller, a little bit more of a mean streak for Miller this upcoming season. I first of all want to make it clear that I don't think like K'Andre Miller is a soft player or anything like that, not even in the slightest, but there are certain Ranger fans that I think might voice that opinion. I don't think it's true. You look at his career numbers as it pertains to hits, 294 career NHL games for K'Andre Miller, 554 hits in those games. So he's out there, throwing his weight around a little bit. But I want to see just a little bit more edge, a little bit more mean streak. I want to see him knocking guys around in the crease. There's times where Miller will be on the ice and he'll be in the right position and everything. But you'll see somebody kind of set up shop in front of Igor, in front of Quick, whoever's in the net on that night. And I don't know. I just feel like Miller could do a little bit more to make them a little bit more uncomfortable. Miller's a big guy. He's 6'5", 215 pounds. And I think there's times where he uses that to his advantage. I think there's also times where he doesn't do enough of that as he possibly could. But I want to see K'Andre Miller get to a point where opposing teams are very well aware of the fact that he's on the ice. And you're aware that this is a big dude. And man, you better not be carrying the puck with your head down, because he'll clobber you, right? And he doesn't have to do it dirty. I don't want him to do it dirty. I don't want any Ranger player. I don't want any player in the NHL to play dirty. He doesn't have to cross-check anybody in the throat. He doesn't have to try to give somebody a concussion or take out somebody's knee or anything like that. But K'Andre Miller, I want him to start to get that reputation the way that Jacob Trouba does, the way that, you could even say Matt Rempe does. These are big dudes, and you got to keep your head up when you've got the puck and those guys are on the ice. I want K'Andre Miller to do enough where he starts to kind of get that reputation. Maybe he has that reputation among opposing teams more than I realize, but I don't think that he does. And I would just like to see that, because I think he's certainly capable of it. He does hit a decent amount. We saw him get into his first career fight last season, talking about edge and physicality. That was the big 5v5 fight to start the game against the Devils, and basically destroyed John Marino and showed him some mercy after, because Marino was down on the ice and Miller backed off. But that was his first career fight, and he easily won it. So a little bit more edge, a little bit more nastiness for K'Andre Miller this upcoming season. That's a best case scenario. I think also second power play unit, that job is seemingly up for grabs. You can make the case of a lot of different Ranger defensemen playing that role and sort of being the quarterback. The Rangers could do something where they have on their second unit 3 forwards and 2 defensemen. They could go with 4 forwards and 1 defenseman, but regardless of which they choose, it seems like that spot is up for grabs. You can make a case for Zach Jones. You can make a case for K'Andre Miller. I would say probably even Jacob Trouba. You can make a case for him as well. He'd probably be my least popular pick of the 3 that I just mentioned there, but yeah, Miller, why not? I mean, he's a good offensive defenseman, which kind of leads me into my next point as well. I think in a best case scenario for Miller, we see an uptick in points for Miller. He went from 2 years ago having 43 points in 79 games to just 30 points in 80 games last season. So a little bit of a drop off there as far as offensive production. He has never hit double-digit goals either. He had 8 last year, 9 the year before that, 7 the year before that. I think that's within reach for K'Andre Miller as well. Playing on the second power play unit would help that a little bit, although the Rangers' second unit doesn't tend to get a lot of time when the Rangers do have the man advantage. So we'll see. But in one way or another, K'Andre Miller, an uptick in points, I think that's certainly within reach for him in this upcoming season. And I think also in a best case scenario, he doesn't get enough credit for this, not in the slightest. K'Andre Miller will continue to be the Rangers' Iron Man. You look at games played for K'Andre Miller ever since he's come into the league, it is extraordinarily impressive. Last year, 80 games played for K'Andre Miller. And if I'm not mistaken, he had that thing where he stepped away from the team briefly to deal with mental health. And, I applaud him for being honest with himself and honest with the team and doing whatever he had to do in that situation. But the reason I bring that up is because even the 2 games he missed last year wasn't due to injury. So there's that. The year before that, he played in 79 games. And again, it had nothing to do with injury. The 3 games that he missed there were all due to him being suspended. So the last 2 years combined, you look at the regular season, he's missed 5 games, and 0 of them have had anything to do with injury. This guy is the Ranger Iron Man, and in a way, he's almost like, I don't want to be too mean here because I love Ryan Lindgren, but in a way, he's almost kind of the polar opposite of that. Ryan Lindgren goes out there, he plays his heart out. We know that. We saw him get into a fight the other night to stick up for his teammate. Just a hard-nosed, blue-collar player that plays with an edge. A throwback player for sure is Ryan Lindgren. But we talked about this during a crossover with Locked On Flyers. At one time or another, it feels like to me the Rangers are only going to be able to afford one of the two of K'Andre Miller and Ryan Lindgren. And you could make a case for either one, that they play a different style of game for sure. But the one thing that I think tips the scales probably in Miller's favor is the simple fact that this dude never misses any games. And Ryan Lindgren, the same certainly cannot be said there. So K'Andre Miller, we'll see what the future holds for him. But yeah, best case scenario, he continues to be one of the most durable players on the Rangers. He logs a ton of ice time. He hits, he blocks shots, he does all that good stuff. He plays on the penalty kill. We'll see if he gets some power play time this upcoming season as well. But yeah, man, K'Andre Miller, it never gets talked about. And I include myself in that. I should talk about it more than I do. He is one of the true bona fide Iron Men for this New York Ranger team. So in a best case scenario, that continues to be the case for K'Andre Miller. We're going to keep everything rolling in just a second. We're going to shift our attention to the battle for the 6th defenseman spot, and I guess really the 7th defenseman spot as well, because if Lindgren, isn't available, which he's not going to be, you'll see somebody take his place in the lineup, and then, of course, you'll also have at least one healthy scratch for a defenseman for the start of this upcoming season. So we will get into that. We're going to talk about every candidate, everybody that has a chance to be the Rangers' 6th defenseman to start the upcoming season, and we will do that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get 100 in the middle of your game, you can check the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You will get $2,000 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. We are going to close out today's episode by talking about the latest in the battle for the suddenly open 6th defenseman spot for the New York Rangers. Obviously, Ryan Lindgren is injured. We hope that he gets back sooner rather than later, but while he's out, that clearly creates, an issue for the Rangers and a vacancy in the lineup, and one that's going to have to be filled by somebody, one of these individuals that we're going to talk about right here and right now. To begin with, though, it is very, very unfortunate. Obviously, everything that happened to Ryan Lindgren going to be out for at least a few weeks, and we'll obviously monitor his status and keep you guys updated on everything going on with Lindgren as far as, when we might see him back in the lineup in a best-case scenario. You guys know how it is with hockey players. Never bet against them beating their timetable, but we'll just have to wait and see with Ryan Lindgren. One other thing that I'll say about Lindgren here, too, because I mentioned this in a recent episode, obviously talking about this injury. I didn't have this stat in front of me at the time, but I mentioned how vastly different the Ranger record is when he's in the lineup versus when he's not in the lineup. I'll share that with everybody right here, right now, just so that everybody has an idea. And, again, I can see both sides after this season as far as what to do with Ryan Lindgren beyond this upcoming season. But this is the Ranger record with him in the lineup, 199, 103, and 31. If we combine all those losses, it's 199 and 134. And this is the Ranger record without Lindgren in the lineup, 51, 53, and 17. Or if we combine the losses, 51 and 70 without Ryan Lindgren in the lineup. That is a staggering difference, and one that can't just be written off. That's too big of a sample size to just say, well, other circumstances. And I'm sure there are other circumstances, having to do with why the Rangers won and lost some of those games. But that is a massive difference. And again, way too many games to ignore. So we're going to go ahead, go through literally every single candidate here that could possibly, conceivably replace Ryan Lindgren in the lineup on opening night. Now, I know Lindgren being a lefty, the conventional wisdom is that you go with a lefty defenseman in his place, and the Rangers might well do that. We'll see. But there's always a way around that. You can always have somebody, switch sides. They had Chad Ruhwedel the other day in practice. He's usually on the right side. He was playing on the left side. So there's always a way to do it. But the bottom line, here are the candidates as far as I'm concerned. You've got Chad Ruhwedel, Connor Mackey, Braden Schneider, Ben Harpur, Casey Fitzgerald, Madison Bowie, Matthew Robertson, and Victor Mancini. Mancini we talked about quite a bit in our last episode, and at this point, honestly, I think my vote is probably for Victor Mancini. Try to catch lightning in a bottle here. He's played very well. The Lindgren injury is obviously unfortunate for everybody involved, but let's make the best of a bad situation and promote the kid to the NHL. But we'll close with Mancini. A couple more thoughts on him. Right now, let's just go through the list. First of all, Chad Ruhwedel. When Lindgren first went down, I think that a lot of us, I know I did, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I kind of figured, okay, Zach Jones moves up the lineup, and Chad Ruhwedel goes from seventh defenseman into the lineup. I'm not so sure that's going to happen now. Chad Ruhwedel, 34 years old, acquired from the Penguins at last year's deadline, and served as a, healthy scratch defenseman for the Rangers for the majority of the stretch run and the playoffs. He did get into 5 regular season games. I thought played pretty well, signed the 1-year extension with the Rangers at the end of this offseason. Unfortunately for Ruhwedel, didn't really stand out in his preseason game against the Islanders. In fact, he was graded as the worst player on the ice for the Rangers. I didn't think that he played that poorly, but regardless, I don't think it was a great showing as far as Ruhwedel trying to claim that number 6 defenseman job. Now, he could still end up being the guy. First of all, there's the rest of training camp. There's also 3 preseason games left, and it's possible that Laviolette just prefers a steady veteran player to take the place of Ryan Lindgren and hopefully hold it down until Lindgren gets back. So I think Ruhwedel, he'll be one of the top 2 or 3 candidates involved here to potentially take Ryan Lindgren's spot in the lineup. You've also got Connor Mackey, and this is another guy that I think, especially when you consider the fact that he lined up with Adam Fox in the most recent preseason game, this is somebody else that I think is going to get high consideration to being in the opening night lineup. He is also a lefty, so that can only help his cause, you would think. I mean, again, righties should not be discounted just by the fact that they're righties, but maybe lefties, that's a little bit more in your favor if you're trying to be the 6th defenseman for this New York Ranger team right now. But Mackey, 28 years old, 40 career NHL games with the Flames, Coyotes, and Rangers. Played 1 game with the Rangers last year. It was against the Senators. It's when the Rangers were slumping. He came up and got into a fight, and then the Rangers started playing well again, and people were having some fun with it and saying that Connor Mackey, saved the season. But I won't go that far. But this is somebody that clearly has some edge to his game. We've seen that a couple of times. He actually got into a fight in the most recent preseason game against the Bruins. He was hit in the corner, and next thing you know, the gloves come off. But yeah, clearly some edge and some nastiness to his game. And like I said, I think the very simple fact that he has been with Adam Fox, that probably bodes well for his chances going forward here. It doesn't mean that it's automatically going to happen, but if we see in the next preseason game or the next time that Mackey dresses for a preseason game, if he's back out there with Adam Fox again, then I think at that point, the Rangers are serious about this and that he very well might be the guy to replace Ryan Lindgren in that opening night lineup. Another option, another lefty, is Braden Schneider, 25 years old, formerly undrafted, actually made his NHL debut with the Rangers this past year and played in just the 1 game. Has been a regular for the Hartford Wolfpack for the last 3 years, been an overall solid defenseman there. He's in the mix. If there's a situation where, they go with, say, Ruhwedel to be the number 6 defenseman, then maybe somebody like Braden Schneider could make the team as the number 7 defenseman. He would be a healthy scratch on most nights, but I don't think that possibility can be discounted. Ben Harpur, another lefty option, PTO with Hartford 2 years ago, got called up, ended up playing, fairly well for the Rangers, especially relative to the expectations that he came with. So did fine, but then it's kind of gone south for him, replaced in the lineup that year by Mikkola after the trade with St. Louis. Was started this past season with the Hartford Wolfpack, had to pass through waivers. He did, scored a great goal on a strong drive to the net, but he hurt his shoulder, was out for the season. And the thing I've always liked about Ben Harpur is he really goes out of his way to protect his teammates out there. So another veteran option here for sure. I thought he had a tough night, though, in the second preseason game against the Islanders, so it would seem to be an uphill battle for Hartford. You've also got Casey Fitzgerald, 27 years old, 63 games in the NHL with the Sabres and the Panthers. Did not appear in an NHL game last year. I don't feel like he's really stood out all that much. I did like in the preseason game, the first preseason game against the Bruins. He was out there. He was dressed. You had Hedl taken down, and Fitzgerald really went after the player that did it. So I appreciate that. Fitzgerald, though, seems to be a long shot to me. Speaking of long shots, 29-year-old righty Madison Bowie, 158 career games with the Caps, Wings, Blackhawks, and Canucks, but only 4 total games in the last 4 seasons combined, in town on a PTO, and again, feels like an enormous long shot. And if you don't believe me, just consider the fact that he has not even played in one of these first 3 preseason games, which is rough if you're trying to make the team. To me, it tells me that they're not really looking at him as all that viable of an option. I guess crazier things have happened, but an enormous long shot is Madison Bowie. You've also got Matthew Robertson, second-round pick, now 23 years old, hasn't done enough in the AHL to get the call-up to the Rangers. We've seen other guys. I mentioned Scanlon, I mentioned Mackey. These guys were called up last season for a game each rather than Matthew Robertson. And Robertson right now apparently also dealing with I believe it's a minor injury, but he's a lefty. You could just throw him out there and say sink or swim. That's at least a possibility. And maybe that's something the Rangers would consider if not for the play of our final candidate here today. And that would, of course, be Victor Mancini. Now, Mancini, the one thing that he has working against him is the fact that he's a righty. But again, we've talked about this before. When it comes to righty defenseman, lefty defenseman, left wing, right wing, you can always find a way to work around this if you really want to. It may not be, the pieces may not fit perfectly, but you can work your way around that and just go with the 6th best defenseman. I'm in favor of that strategy for sure. But again, we talked about Mancini quite a bit in the last episode after we were recapping the win against the Bruins. 22 years old, former 5th-round pick by the Rangers. Last year was his first in the AHL, 7 regular season games, 10 playoff games, but very impressive in the 2-game rookie series against the Flyers. I mean, he just jumped off the screen, watching those games. Strong couple of preseason games here as well. We've gone over those highlights in our game breakdowns. And the other thing too is that we have seen the Rangers, and it's one thing that I really like about this franchise. They are not going to lock you into your draft status forever. They're not going to just say, well, he's too young, he can't possibly play at the NHL yet. They don't do that. They've had a lot of in-house defensemen that have debuted at a younger age than Victor Mancini. We talked about that in the last episode as well. So for me, for my money, he's the guy right now. I'm putting Zach Jones with Adam Fox on opening night. We can leave Miller and Trouba together. I would like to have Schneider with Miller. You know what? Let's do that. Let's do Jones-Fox as your first pairing. Let's do Miller-Schneider as your second pairing. And then let's go ahead and put Mancini with Jacob Trouba as your third pairing. That's how I'm going to start it. I know he doesn't have a lot of experience, but he's played very well. And to me, at least thus far in the preseason, he's the best option, the best looking option the Rangers currently have. It's a bold move, but we've seen the Rangers do things like this in the past. So figure we can pretty much call it there. If you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.